I went to Starbucks 2 or 3 times a week, usually in the morning so I'd get my caffeine fix right before class. I'd never had a problem there before, at least, that was until this one time. On the morning it happened, I walked into Starbucks at about 8:30 a.m. It was busy-ish, but most of the people were sitting at tables and the line itself wasn't that long. As I stood in line to order, I noticed this woman with short, messy hair and a brown jacket walk in and go straight to the counter where the employees placed the drinks. She continued to just stand there and stare at the empty counter. I thought it was a bit odd she didn't get in line first, since this was several years ago when online orders weren't a thing yet, but none of the employees seemed fazed by it at all. The other customers waited by this woman, and when their names were called, their drinks were placed on the counter. They walked over and took them. I placed my order and then stood as far away from the woman as I could while still being able to see the counter. Another guy was waiting too, and he went up to the counter and collected his drink without a problem. I noticed how the woman was just staring at the counter without blinking. Thinking back on it, it was really odd. It definitely seemed like she was waiting for something. When the employee called my name and put my drink on the counter, I began to walk up, but I wasn't the only one. That woman moved up too. Since she was closer to the counter than I was, she reached for my drink before I did and took it. Then she walked back to the spot she'd been standing in and just held it. She took a sip of my drink and gave me an evil grin. Just how I like it, she said. Was she referring to the drink or me? I didn't know what to say or do. I'm a pretty shy person, so I found the whole thing really awkward. I managed to get an employee's attention and quietly explained that the woman had taken my drink. By this point, I saw her taking sips from it as she kept staring my way. I'm not sure if she was looking at me or the counter, but there was a blank look in her eyes. The employee clearly didn't want to confront the woman either, so he nodded and said he'd remake my order. I waited closer to the counter this time, but with all the other people coming over and picking up their orders, I felt in the way, so I ended up taking a couple of steps back. As the other people went up and got their orders, this woman remained where she was and stared at the counter as she sipped from my drink. When my name was called, I started to walk around another customer to get to it, but then the woman stepped forward, and to my horror, she grabbed my drink off the counter again. Then she moved back to the spot where she'd been standing and just stood there, a cup in each hand as she silently stared at the counter. I was pretty mad about this, but as I said, I'm a shy person, so I just wanted to forget about it and leave. But the employee who'd seen what happened leaned across the counter and told me that he was going to sort this out. Then he walked around the corner and went over to the woman. I heard him politely explain to her that those weren't her drinks, and if she wanted one, she'd have to line up and order. The woman didn't say anything, but then she balanced the cups on top of one another and started tapping her fingers against the top lid, and continue with the monotonous tapping. The employee again told her that they weren't her drinks and that she needed to leave before they called the police. I was feeling really uncomfortable at this point, so I just decided to forget about my coffee and go. I think the employee may have shouted out to me as I walked past them, but I don't know. I didn't stop walking until I reached the other end of the parking lot where I parked my car. When I did look back, what I saw really creeped me out. That woman was standing outside of Starbucks with both the coffees balanced in her hand. She was staring straight at me as she tapped her fingers against the lid. I walked away as quickly as I could, and thankfully, she didn't follow me or anything. I never went to that Starbucks again. To this day, I still don't know why that woman went in there with no intention of ordering anything, and why she decided to prey on me. One summer, I got a part-time job in my local Starbucks. I got along well with my coworkers, and I was grateful to be earning some extra money. For the few months I worked there, it was pretty uneventful. Seriously, I think the worst thing that happened was when someone spilled their drink by mistake. but that all changed this one work shift. It was close to closing time, so if I remember correctly, close to 9 p.m. The only ones left working at the store were my manager and I. She was tidying up the back room and I was cleaning up out front. There were only a handful of customers left and they were almost finished with their drinks. About 5 minutes before closing, 2 men came in. They were dressed pretty nicely in dress shirts and blazers. I figured they'd come from some sort of event or something. The first man in the blazer grabbed a soda out of the fridge, but then seemed to change his mind and put it back, whispered something under his breath to the other man, and then they both headed toward the door. I found this kind of weird, but before I could think any more about it, my manager shouted for me to help her with something. By that point, the other customers had left, and the 2 men were leaving too, so I went into the back. When I returned, the place was empty, so I finished cleaning up. Everything seemed fine, so my manager did one final routine check around, including the restrooms. A few minutes later, she walked over to me with an alarmed look on her face and asked me if I was sure all the customers had left, since the restroom door was either jammed or someone was in there. She said she knocked on the door, but no one had answered. I told her the only ones I could think of were the well-dressed men, but last I saw they were heading toward the door. We obviously didn't want to lock up with people trapped in the bathroom, so I walked over to the restroom with her, and we knocked on it and asked if everything was okay in there, since we were about to close up. There was silence at first, but then we heard someone cough. Now we knew someone was definitely in there. Again, we knocked loudly and announced that we were closing up and they'd have to leave. There were a few seconds of silence, then a male voice yelled, "No!" then muttered something in a foreign language I didn't recognize. My manager explained that they couldn't stay in there, and unless there was a problem, they'd have to leave right now. Again, there was a few seconds pause, then a gruff, "No!" followed by the same foreign muttering. My manager said that we needed to lock up, so if they didn't come out now, she was calling the police. After this, she signaled for me to step away from the door. Then she went and called the police. We sat at a table and waited for them to show up. They arrived about 10 minutes later and told us to wait outside while they dealt with the issue. It took a while, but when the police finally reappeared, they were able to pull one of the men from before out of the restroom and take him outside. But it was what I saw next that horrified me. The police confiscated an 18-inch machete the man had hidden inside his blazer. As they walked him past me, his eyes locked on mine, and he gave me this cold look that made me shiver. Then he muttered something under his breath that I couldn't make out. I saw him look out past the store window and across the road. I swear I saw the other man he'd been with standing there. I told the police, but when they looked, the other man had vanished. The man was taken in for questioning, but last I heard, he was never charged and was free to go that same day. I just don't understand why he hid in the restroom that night. If he'd been locked in all night, then what did he plan on doing, especially with a machete? Thinking about what horrible things he could have done with that machete to me or my manager kept me up at night for a very long time after that. I don't really like coffee, but I went through a stage of going to Starbucks regularly because the girl I had a crush on worked there. Dumb, I know, but I never thought it would take such a dark turn. The girl I liked, we'll call her Nina, we'd gone to high school together, but I never dared to ask her out. Then one day at work, when my boss stuck me on a coffee run, I saw Nina working there. Before I even realized what was happening, Starbucks became part of my daily routine. I'd go in there each lunch break in the hopes of seeing Nina. She was always really sweet and friendly and seemed happy to see me. Then one day, things got creepy. I went in there on my lunch break as usual. It was pretty busy, and I noticed Nina behind the counter, but she was making coffee and hadn't noticed me. I was walking toward the back of the line when I heard my name being called. I have a fairly common name, so I thought it was for someone else, but then I heard my name being shouted again. I looked over at the drink collection counter, and one of the employees was holding a takeout drink cup and looking straight at me. He was trying to get my attention and again called my name while looking directly at me. I awkwardly walked over there and explained that I hadn't ordered my drink yet. The guy smiled at me and said it was all taken care of. Confused, I thanked him, took the cup, and left. I assumed it must have been from Nina, and although I was stoked about this, I was also disappointed I didn't get to properly thank her. I walked back taking small sips of my drink. It was only when I went to throw it in the trash that I noticed black writing on the bottom of the cup. It was a number, and above it said, "Text me." Believing this was Nina's number, that evening I messaged her, and she replied straight away. The conversation flowered, and we seemed to get along really well. I was texting her the next day, and she was telling me she was bored at work. I said I'd pop in on my way to work to see her, but she got really defensive and was adamant that I shouldn't go in there. Then she texted, saying she wanted to be able to talk to me face to face, and asked if I'd like to meet up that night. I immediately said yes, and she sent me a time and place. I couldn't wait to meet up with her, but I was also really nervous. I was annoying my roommate so much with my nervous pacing that he ended up asking me what was going on. When I told him all about Nina and said I was going to get an Uber to meet her, he insisted on driving me there. So I took him up on his offer. About 20 minutes into the drive, we seemed to pass a lot of empty fields and very few houses. It seemed really strange that Nina would want to meet somewhere so far off the grid. When we reached the address, it was this rundown trailer surrounded by weeds and junk. My friend asked me if I was sure I had the right address, and I told him I did. Something did seem off about this, so I tried calling Nina, but it went straight to voicemail. I was about to send her a text saying I was outside when my phone beeped. It was from Nina, telling me she saw me and to come inside. A light in the trailer came on, and I saw the door open and someone was there looking over at us. My friend told me there was no way he was letting me go in there, and before I could step out of the car, he started driving away. I didn't really know what to say. I didn't want to let Nina down, but I also had seen so many red flags about going inside that trailer. As we drove back, my phone buzzed several times. All messages were from Nina. They were a mix of begging and weirdness. The last one was the creepiest one of all. It said, "You belong to me now. Come back now." The messages were so messed up, and I was glad I didn't go in the trailer. I stopped going to Starbucks, and I didn't message Nina again, at least not until the next time my boss made me go on a coffee run. When I went in there, Nina was working the register, and right after seeing me, she gave me a friendly smile and asked how I'd been since she hadn't seen me in a while. Not knowing what else to do, I apologized for leaving that night. She gave me a confused look and said she had no idea what I was talking about. It turns out that Nina never set aside a drink for me that day, and whoever I was messaging definitely wasn't her. I mentioned the employee who'd called my name and given me the coffee, and Nina covered her mouth in shock. It turns out he'd been fired for harassing customers. I hadn't been messaging Nina at all. It seems likely that it was that guy. I can't help but think about that night and what would have happened to me if I'd gotten an Uber as planned and I'd set foot inside of that trailer.